High in the Adirondack Mountains stands a weathered cabin that's about to become the intersection of two extraordinary lives. Thomas Wheeler, a retired craftsman looking for one last purpose, discovers the abandoned structure and begins pouring his heart into its restoration. What he doesn't realize is that every nail he drives echoes through the life of Claire Montgomery, a billionaire who spent 40 years trying to forget what happened in that very cabin. She's finally returning to confront her past, only to find a stranger rebuilding the walls that once housed her greatest love story. As autumn leaves begin to fall, these two souls will discover that sometimes the most powerful second chances come disguised as coincidences. Thomas Wheeler's morning began, like all the others since his retirement, with the gentle scraping of his father's old chisel against a worn leather strop. The ritual was as much about maintaining memories as it was about keeping the tools sharp. His workshop, a converted garage that still held the faint scent of motor oil beneath the pervading aroma of wood shavings, was his sanctuary in a world that seemed to be moving too fast. The tools lined the pegboard wall in perfect order, each one a story of craftsmanship passed down through generations. The collection had started with his father's basic set, 3 chisels, 2 hand planes, and a dovetail saw that had carved out a living for the Wheeler family during the lean years. Thomas had added to it slowly over 4 decades of restoration. Work, each tool carefully chosen and maintained as if it were a family heirloom. He paused in his morning routine, calloused fingers running along the smooth maple handle of his father's favorite chisel. The brass ferrule still bore the small dent from when he'd dropped it as a boy, earning himself a stern lecture about respecting one's tools. "These aren't just pieces of metal, son," his father had said. "They're the hands we use to shape the world." The quiet of his workshop was interrupted by the distant rumble of thunder. Thomas glanced through the window at the gathering clouds over the Adirondack peaks. The weather report had warned of an early autumn storm system moving through, but he had work to do regardless. Since Sarah's passing 3 years ago, he'd found that keeping busy was the best medicine for an empty house. His latest project sat on the workbench, a Victorian-era writing desk that needed its veneer repaired. It should have held his attention, as such projects always had, but his mind kept drifting back to the abandoned cabin he'd discovered yesterday. Its weathered frame, somehow still proud against the mountain backdrop. Thomas had seen plenty of old buildings in his lifetime, but something about this one was different. Maybe it was the way the morning light had caught the leaded glass in the front windows, or how the hand-hewn beams spoke of craftsmanship from another era. Or perhaps it was simply that he saw in its neglected state a reflection of himself, something solid and well-built, just waiting for someone to care enough to bring it back to life. He set down the chisel and pulled out his notebook, where he'd sketched rough plans after his initial inspection of the cabin. The foundation seemed solid, though the north corner would need attention. The roof would be the biggest challenge. Several seasons of heavy snow had taken their toll. But it was the details that drew his eye. The hand-carved corbels under the eaves, the intricate window casings, the type of craftsmanship that had become rare in a world of mass production. A knock at the workshop door pulled him from his contemplation. "Mr. Wheeler." It was Danny, the teenage son of his nearest neighbor, about a quarter-mile down the mountain road. "Mum wanted me to check if you're still coming for dinner Sunday. She's making pot roast." Thomas smiled, grateful for neighbors who hadn't let him become a complete hermit. "Wouldn't miss it, Danny. Tell your mother I'll bring apple pie." He'd been baking more lately, using Sarah's old recipes. It gave him something to share, a way to maintain connections when his instinct was to retreat into solitude. As Danny headed back down the gravel driveway, Thomas returned to his workbench. His fingers found the old business card he used as a bookmark in his notebook. Wheeler Fine Restorations, printed in simple black text, with a phone number that hadn't been in service for years. He'd never been one for retirement in the traditional sense. Slowing down had meant taking only the projects that truly interested him, the ones that called to his craftsman's soul. That cabin in the woods was calling to him now, louder than any project had in years. There would be questions to answer, of course. Ownership, permits, the practical matters that came with any restoration. But first, he needed to pack his tools. Some projects couldn't wait for perfect weather or perfect circumstances. Sometimes you had to trust your hands and your heart to know when something was worth saving. Claire Montgomery's corner office on the 58th floor of Montgomery Tower commanded a view of Manhattan that most people only saw in movies. At dawn, when the city was still shaking off its nighttime slumber, she often found herself standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, coffee cooling in her hand, watching the sun paint the skyline in shades of gold and promise. But this morning, her attention was fixed on something else entirely, a weathered photograph that had slipped from an old filing cabinet during the office's technological overhaul. Ms. Montgomery, her assistant Rachel, hovered in the doorway. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes, and Mr. Chen from Singapore is waiting on line 2 about the merger. Claire didn't turn from the window. The photograph in her hands showed a cabin nestled in the Adirondacks, summer leaves framing its rustic beauty. July 1983, according to the faded date stamp. She could almost smell the pine needles, feel the rough wood under her fingertips. "Cancel the board meeting," she said quietly, "and tell James to handle the merger call." "Cancel the—" Rachel's voice trailed off. In 15 years as Claire's assistant, she had never heard those words. Claire. Montgomery didn't cancel meetings. She ran them with precision timing and laser focus, building her father's modest investment firm into a global financial empire through sheer force of will and unflagging determination. Also, get me everything we have on property holdings in Essex County, New York, specifically around Lake Placid. Claire finally turned from the window, and Rachel was struck by something different in her employer's expression. The usual sharp-edged efficiency had softened into something more contemplative. "Of course. Any particular property?" Claire set the photograph on her desk, next to the latest quarterly reports and acquisition proposals. The contrast was stark. The fuzzy, aging image beside the crisp digital presentations that normally commanded her attention. "There's a cabin!" Bought in 82 or 83. It would have been purchased through a subsidiary, probably listed as a recreational property or investment holding. Rachel nodded, already tapping notes into her tablet. She didn't ask why her boss was suddenly interested in a 40-year-old property purchase. Working for Claire had taught her that questions often answered themselves in time. Alone again, Claire sank into her chair, the supple leather failing to provide its usual comfort. The empire she'd built surrounded her. Awards on the walls, financial journals bearing her name, screens displaying real-time market data from every corner of the globe. Montgomery Financial Group managed over $200 billion in assets. She'd been on the cover of Forbes 3 times. The Wall Street Journal called her the Oracle of Manhattan for her uncanny ability to predict market trends. But none of that seemed to matter as she stared at the photograph. She'd buried this part of her past so completely, sealed it away. Behind walls of work and achievement. Why was it surfacing now? Maybe it was the milestone birthday looming on the horizon. 65? The age her father had been when he handed her the reins of the company, telling her to make something greater of it. She had, but at what cost? The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Montgomery, I have that property information you requested. Thank you, Rachel. Please bring it in." The file was surprisingly thick for a property she'd tried so hard to forget. Purchase agreements, tax records, local ordinance compliance documents, all preserved with the meticulous attention to detail that had helped build her empire. But it was the most recent satellite images that caught her eye. Someone was there. The roof, which had been slowly deteriorating in each successive year's property assessment photos, showed signs of recent repair. Claire touched the image on the screen. Then the old photograph, 4 decades dissolved in the space between them. She could hear Michael's laugh echoing across the lake, feel the rough wood of the porch railing under her hands, taste the coffee they'd shared watching summer sunrises. "Rachel," she called, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of a decision already made. "Clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks. And get me a car to Lake Placid. Not a driver, I'll drive myself." The last time she'd made that drive, she'd been running away from something. Now, 40 years later, she was finally ready to face what she'd left behind. The morning dew still clung to the tall grass as Thomas pulled his truck up to the cabin. He'd spent the better part of yesterday at the county clerk's office, trying to trace the property's ownership. The records had led him through a maze of holding companies and corporate subsidiaries before dead-ending at something called Evergreen Properties, LLC. The clerk, a helpful woman named Betty, who remembered him from his contracting days, had shrugged and said sometimes vacation properties got tucked away in corporate portfolios and forgotten. "Just be careful," she'd warned. "These old places, they have a way of holding on to secrets." Now, standing in front of the cabin with his father's toolbox in hand, Thomas understood what she meant. The structure had good bones. That much was clear from his initial inspection. But there was something else here, something that spoke of lives lived and memories made. He could feel it in the worn threshold, the carefully crafted window frames, the way the morning light played through the dusty glass. He set his tools down on the sagging porch and pulled out his notebook. First rule of restoration: document everything. His camera clicked as he captured the cabin's current state, paying special attention to the architectural details that would need to be preserved. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Whoever had built this place had taken their time, had cared about the details. The front door was stuck, swollen with moisture, but it yielded to gentle pressure from his shoulder. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of light streaming through the windows. The main room was larger than he'd expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A kitchen area occupied the far corner, its fixtures decades out of date, but solidly built. "Well, old girl," he murmured, running his hand along a wooden beam. "Let's see what we can do for you." He began with the windows, carefully removing the first set of frames. As he worked the second window free, something fluttered to the floor. A leather-bound book, small enough to fit in a pocket that had been wedged between the frame and the wall. The pages were yellowed but intact, protected from the elements by its hiding place. Thomas settled onto the floor, dust swirling around him, and opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, decisive, dating from the summer of 1983. He read the first entry. "The cabin is finally finished. M says I'm crazy for wanting to be so far from the city, but he doesn't understand yet. Up here, watching the sun rise. Over the lake, I feel like I can breathe, like I can be someone other than Charles Montgomery's daughter, the girl everyone expects to take over the family business." He closed the book carefully. Private thoughts, not meant for his eyes. He tucked it safely into his tool bag. Someone might come looking for it someday. The work consumed his morning. He cleared debris, assessed damage, made lists of materials needed. The roof would need attention before the weather turned, but the immediate concern was that sagging corner of the foundation. He was examining the stonework when he heard a vehicle approaching. Well, if it isn't Thomas Wheeler. The voice belonged to Frank Miller, who'd run the local hardware store for as long as anyone could remember. "Betty at the clerk's office said you might be up here. Thought I'd check if you needed anything hauled up from town." Thomas straightened, brushing dirt from his knees. "Frank, good to see you. Sarah used to say you'd never really retire," Frank said, looking up at the cabin. "She knew you'd find another project. She knew me better than I knew myself sometimes." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Place has quite a history, you know. Summer people mostly. But there was some talk back in the 80s. A young couple spent a season here. Story goes they were from different worlds. She was some big city heiress. He was a local architect. Built this place together, then one day she just disappeared. He waited around for months, then sold it and moved out west somewhere." Thomas thought of the journal in his bag. "Any idea what happened to them?" "Nobody really knows. But that's the thing about these mountains. They hold on to stories like morning mist. Sometimes they never quite let go. Frank gestured at his truck. "I've got some pressure-treated lumber in back if you need it." Was delivering to the Anderson place, but they cancelled. They spent the next hour unloading lumber and discussing what supplies Thomas might need. Frank's knowledge of local suppliers and materials would prove invaluable. As they worked, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled into something larger than a simple restoration project. The journal, Frank's story, the careful craftsmanship of the place, it all spoke of a deeper narrative, one that was still unfolding. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas returned to his work, the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing across the water. Each nail driven was a step toward bringing this place back to life, back to what it had been when that young couple had dreamed. Their dreams here. He didn't know their whole story yet, but he understood something about unfinished business, about the weight of what gets left behind. Sometimes, he thought, restoration wasn't just about fixing what was broken. Sometimes it was about giving the past a chance to make things right. Claire sat in her penthouse study, surrounded by the artifacts of her past. She'd spent the evening going through old boxes that her housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had retrieved from storage. Each item she touched seemed to vibrate with memory. A college, diploma, newspaper clippings of her first major acquisition, and there, at the bottom of a leather portfolio, a business card that made her hands tremble. Michael J. Sullivan, Architectural Design. The card was worn at the edges, and on the back, in his architect's precise handwriting, "Memory is a house we build together." Below that, a quick sketch of the cabin's front elevation, dated June 15th, 1983. Her phone buzzed. "Rachel, as always. The car is arranged for tomorrow morning. I've had the property management company check that the access road is clear. They mentioned there's been some activity at the cabin recently." "What kind of activity?" Claire's voice was sharper than she intended. "They're not sure. Signs of maintenance work, they think. Would you like me to have them investigate further?" Claire stared at the business card in her hand. No, let it be for now." She paused. "Rachel, I need you to do one more thing. Find out what happened to Michael Sullivan. Last known location was somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Probably Oregon or Washington. He would have moved there in late '83 or early '84. "Of course. Though, may I ask why you're doing this now?" The question hung in the air. Why now? Because 65 had seemed so far away when she was 25. Because success had proved to be a hollow companion. Or perhaps because she'd seen her own reflection that morning, and for the first time noticed how much she looked like her mother in those final years. Accomplished, respected, and undeniably alone. "Sometimes," Claire said carefully, "we need to finish old chapters before we can write new ones." After Rachel hung up, Claire opened her laptop. The satellite images of the cabin filled the screen, proof that someone was indeed working there. The new roofing materials stood out clearly against the weathered wood. She should have been angry at the unauthorized work on her property, but instead found herself oddly grateful. Someone cared enough to try to save it. She walked to her bedroom and began to pack, choosing clothes she hadn't worn in years. Jeans, comfortable sweaters, practical shoes. The kind of clothes she'd worn that summer. Mrs. Chen watched from the doorway with poorly concealed concern. "Ms. Montgomery, are you sure about this trip? The board meeting next week. James can handle it." Claire pulled an old leather jacket from the back of her closet. It still fit, though the leather was stiff with age. "I need to do this, Elena. I've put it off for too long." Mrs. Chen nodded, though her worry remained evident. In 20 years of service, she'd never seen Claire like this. "Shall I have the chef prepare something for your journey?" Claire smiled, remembering early mornings in the cabin's small kitchen. "No, thank you. I think I'll stop at that diner in Lake Placid, the one with the blueberry pancakes." If it was still there after all these years. That night, sleep eluded her. She stood at her window, looking out over the city she'd helped shape. 40 years of decisions, deals, and determination had turned her into someone almost unrecognizable. From the young woman who'd fallen in love with an architect's dreams, The business card sat on her nightstand, Michael's handwriting catching the city lights. Memory is a house we build together. But what happened when one person walked away from the construction? What happened to the dreams left unfinished? The promises left unkept? Tomorrow she would begin to find out. She touched the window glass, her reflection overlaying the city lights. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Manhattan, an old cabin waited. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rebuild what she'd left behind. The problem with foundations, Thomas had learned over 40 years of restoration work, was that they told stories you couldn't ignore. As he cleared decades of accumulated debris from around the cabin's base, each stone spoke of choices made and techniques used. This wasn't just any summer cabin. Someone had poured their heart into these foundations. He'd spent the morning at the Lake Placid Records office, where a helpful archivist had unearthed the original blueprints. The papers were carefully preserved, the architect's drawings precise and beautiful in their detail. Michael J. Sullivan read the signature in the corner, accompanied by a registration number and a date. Spring, 1983. "This is remarkable work," Thomas said to himself, spreading the blueprints across his truck's hood. The foundation design was innovative for its time, a hybrid approach that combined traditional stone with modern engineering principles to account for the mountain's seasonal movements. Whoever this Sullivan was, he'd understood both the science and soul of building. The sound of wheels on gravel announced Frank's return. His hardware store truck came to a stop beside Thomas's vehicle, loaded with the supplies they'd discussed yesterday. "Brought those foundation supports you wanted," Frank called out, "and something else you might find interesting." Frank handed over a yellowed newspaper clipping. "Found this while going through some old files. Thought you might want to see it." The Lake Placid Register, August 1983. The photo showed a young couple standing in front of the partially completed cabin. The woman was striking, confident, wealthy-looking, but with a warmth in her smile as she looked at the man beside her. The caption read, "Local architect Michael Sullivan and Claire Montgomery oversee construction of innovative mountain retreat." "Montgomery?" Thomas frowned. "As in Montgomery Financial Group," Frank nodded. "Before she became the Oracle of Manhattan. Story was quite the talk back then. New York heiress falls for local architect. They build their dream cabin together. Nobody could figure out why she left." Thomas thought of the journal hidden in his tool chest. Now he had a name to match to those passionate entries. Did Sullivan ever say what happened? Wasn't much for talking about it. Finished the cabin that fall, stuck around through winter hoping she'd come back. By spring he was gone too. Heard he headed out west, started a sustainable architecture firm or something. Frank started unloading supplies. "Funny thing is, the cabin's been maintained through some property company ever since. Taxes paid, minimal upkeep, but nobody's lived here." Thomas returned to his work, but his mind kept turning over the story as he dug around the foundation's troubled corner. The stonework here was different, not part of Sullivan's original design. Someone had attempted repairs about 15 years ago using modern materials that hadn't played well with the original construction. By mid-afternoon, he'd exposed the full extent of the problem. Water had been pooling against the northwestern corner, gradually undermining the structure. It would take careful work to fix. The kind of careful work he could see in Sullivan's original design before later repairs had complicated things. He was making notes on the blueprint copies when he noticed something interesting. A small compartment designed into the cornerstone, the kind of detail that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Thomas cleared away more dirt and debris, finally exposing the stone in question. It took some careful work with a flathead screwdriver, but eventually the hidden panel came loose. Inside was a copper tube, sealed against the elements. Thomas opened it carefully, pulling out a roll of papers. The first was a letter dated August 1983. "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, it means you've found the foundation's secret. I've always believed that buildings, like relationships, need to be built on truth. This cabin is my truth. Every beam, every stone, every detail is a testament to what I feel for you. Your father's offer was generous, but I don't want to design corporate towers in Manhattan. I want to create spaces that matter, that hold meaning and memory, spaces like this one, where we can build our life together. I'll be waiting for your answer. All my love, Michael. Thomas carefully rolled the letter back up, returning it and the other papers, which appeared to be alternative designs for the cabin, to their copper home. He reset the cornerstone, impanel, marking its location on his working drawings. Some secrets deserved to stay hidden until the right person came looking for them. The sun was setting as he packed up his tools, casting long shadows through the trees. Tomorrow, he'd start the real work of fixing the foundation, of making it strong again. But tonight, he had research to do. Something told him that understanding the cabin's past would be crucial to restoring its future. Sleep had become Claire's enemy. From her penthouse bedroom, Manhattan's endless pulse of light leaked through the edges of custom blackout curtains, but it wasn't the city keeping her awake. On her tablet, she scrolled through the satellite. Images of the cabin again, comparing timestamps. The restoration work had begun 3 weeks ago, starting with the roof. "Who are you?" she whispered, zooming in on a tiny figure captured in one frame. A man on the roof, nothing more than a pixel-sized shadow. Her finger traced the outline of the cabin on the screen, remembering how she'd once traced these same lines on Michael's drafting table back when it was nothing more than a dream on paper. Rachel's evening report sat unopened in her email. Instead, Claire found herself searching news archives. Michael Sullivan, architect, Pacific Northwest. The results were sparse, but telling. A few small articles about sustainable housing projects in Oregon, an award for innovative community design, a mention in an environmental architecture journal from 2010. Then nothing after 2015. Her phone buzzed, a text from James, her CFO. "Board members asking questions about your absence. How should I handle the Meyer acquisition call?" She started to type a detailed response, then deleted it. "You handle it. You know what needs to be done." For the first time in 40 years, the market seemed distant, unimportant. The night stretched on. Claire moved to her study, where she'd left the old business card on her desk. The sketch on the back was simple, but precise. Michael's architects, and capturing the essence of their dream in a few clean lines. She remembered watching him draw, how his face would settle into peaceful concentration, how he could translate imagination into reality with just a pencil and paper. "Ms. Montgomery." Mrs. Chen's voice was soft with concern. "I've brought you some chamomile tea." Claire looked up, surprised to find it was past midnight. "Thank you, Elena. I'm sorry to keep you up." "It's no trouble." Mrs. Chen set down the tea tray. "In my village, we say that sleepless nights mean the past is calling. Sometimes we must answer before we can rest again." Claire smiled weakly. "The past. I've spent 40 years building the future instead. Perhaps that is why it calls so loudly now." Mrs. Chen paused at the door. "The car will be ready at 7. Shall I pack any breakfast?" "No need." Claire turned back to her laptop, where another search had yielded a grainy photo from a 2012 architectural conference. Michael, his hair gone silver, but his stance still straight and proud, speaking at a podium. He was wearing the same kind of simple blue button-down he'd favored during their summer together. Some things, it seemed, never changed. She opened a new browser tab, navigating to Montgomery Financial's internal system. A few clicks took her to the property management records. The cabin's maintenance reports filled her screen. 40 years of minimal upkeep, just enough to keep the structure sound. She'd never sold it, never visited, never let it go, just kept it in stasis, like a time capsule preserving that last perfect summer. But now, someone was waking it up. The latest satellite image showed fresh lumber stacked near the porch, a work truck parked in the clearing. The property management company's report noted, "Unauthorized improvements by unknown party." Recommend legal action. Claire closed the laptop. Through the study's windows, she could see the first hint of dawn touching the city's towers. In a few hours, she would begin the drive north, returning to the place she'd tried so hard to forget, to the dream she'd abandoned for her father's legacy, for the empire she'd built on its foundations. Would the cabin remember her? Would it welcome her back, or had she lost the right to its memories when she'd walked away? And this unknown restorer, was his presence there accident or destiny? The tea had gone cold, untouched. Claire picked up Michael's business card one last time, then slipped it into her jacket pocket. Sleep could wait. Right now she had a journey to prepare for and 40 years of silence to break. The early morning light filtered through the cabin's newly cleaned windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor Thomas had spent the last 2 days carefully stripping and refinishing. The original hardwood had emerged from beneath years of dust and neglect, its grain telling stories of feet that had once walked these boards, of lives that had once filled this space. He was working on the built-in bookshelf next to the fireplace when he found it, a small wooden box, expertly crafted, had been wedged behind the loose backing board. The joinery was exceptional, dovetails cut with precision. The lid fitted so perfectly it seemed to disappear into the body of the box. This was an architect's work, Thomas realized. Someone who understood how things fit together. The box opened with a gentle click. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay a collection of letters and photographs. The top envelope bore a simple inscription, "For the memories we haven't made yet." Thomas carefully unfolded the first letter, the paper, crisp despite its age. "My dearest Michael, I'm sitting in that reading nook you designed, watching the sunrise over the lake. You're still asleep upstairs, exhausted from yesterday's work on the foundation. I love watching you work, the way your hands move with such certainty, the focus in your eyes when you're solving a problem. You see the world differently than anyone I've ever known. Father called again yesterday. The board position is still open, and he's made it clear what he expects. But up here, in this space we're creating together, those expectations feel like echoes from another life. You've shown me there are other ways to build a legacy. I haven't given you my answer yet about moving to Oregon. The sustainable community project you've been offered is exactly the kind of work you've dreamed of doing. I see how your eyes light up when you talk about it. But I'm scared, Michael. Not of Oregon or of living, simply, I'm scared of disappointing everyone who's counted on me to follow the path that's been laid out since I was born. You tell me to follow my heart. You always do. But what if my heart is pulling me in 2 directions? With all my love, Claire. Thomas set the letter aside, understanding now why this box had been hidden away. More letters followed, some from Claire to Michael, others from him to her. Their words painted a picture of a summer filled with hope and possibility, but shadowed by the growing weight of expectations and choices. A photograph slipped from between the pages, Claire and Michael on the cabin's half-built porch, their faces bright with laughter. She was wearing his work shirt, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He had his arm around her, waist architectural plans forgotten in his other hand. They looked so young, so certain, that love could conquer all obstacles. The last letter in the box was dated September 15th, 1983. Michael's handwriting, usually so precise, showed signs of haste or emotion. "Claire, I've been sitting here for hours, trying to find the right words. The cabin is almost finished. Our dream made real in wood and stone. But I feel you slipping away. Every time your father calls, every time another board paper arrives for your review, I see the struggle in your eyes. I won't ask you to choose. That wouldn't be fair to either of us. The Oregon project starts in October. I'm taking it. Not because I want to leave, but because you need space to make your own decision, without feeling like my presence is forcing your hand. The cabin is yours. Every beam and board holds our dreams, and I want you to have them, whatever you decide." If you choose this life, this love we've built, come find me. I'll be waiting. If you choose your father's path, then keep this box. Keep our summer. Sometimes love means letting go so the other person can become who they need to be. Forever. Yours, Michael. Thomas carefully returned the letters to their box, his hands gentle with the weight of their history. Through the window, he could see storm clouds gathering over the mountains. The forecast had warned of heavy rain, and he still needed to finish weatherproofing the roof. But as he climbed the ladder with his tools, he found himself thinking about choices and consequences, about dreams deferred and paths not taken. He understood now why this cabin felt different from his other restoration projects. It wasn't just a building. It was a monument to love and possibility, to the moments that define a life. The first drops of rain began to fall as he worked. But Thomas didn't mind. Sometimes, he thought, the most important repairs were the ones you couldn't see from the outside. The old map sat on the passenger seat of Claire's Mercedes, its creases worn soft with age. She'd found it in the same box as Michael's business card, their hand-drawn annotations still visible, marking hiking trails and secret spots around. The lake. The GPS on her dashboard offered a faster route, but she followed the familiar roads, marked in Michael's precise architectural hand. Route 73 wound through the mountains exactly as she remembered, though the little general store where they'd bought their groceries was now an artisanal coffee shop. Claire pulled into its parking lot, needing a moment to steady herself. The mountains rose around her, ancient and unchanging, making her 40 years of empire building feel suddenly insignificant. Her phone buzzed. Rachel, of course. The board is asking about the Meyer acquisition. James is handling it, but they're insisting on speaking with you directly. Tell them I'm unavailable. Claire's voice was firm. And Rachel, I found something interesting in the property records. The cabin's architect, Michael Sullivan, he never cashed out his ownership stake. Legally, he still owns half the property. A pause. Would you like me to contact our lawyers about buying him out? Claire watched an elderly couple emerge. From the coffee shop, hands clasped, sharing a private joke. No lawyers, just, if you find him, let me know. The final turn onto the lake road nearly broke her. Every curve was familiar, every view loaded with memory. She and Michael had walked this road countless times that summer, planning their future between kisses, believing that love could bridge any gap. The Mercedes felt wrong here, too sleek, too corporate. Michael's old pickup truck had suited these roads better. The lake appeared through the trees, sunlight dancing on its surface. Claire pulled over at the overlook, the same spot, where she'd first fallen in love with the location. She'd been skeptical when Michael brought her here. This New York society girl, more comfortable in Manhattan penthouses than mountain cabins. But he'd spread out his preliminary sketches right here on the hood of his truck, showing her how the cabin would nestle into the landscape, how the windows would frame the sunrise over the water. Architecture isn't just about buildings, he'd told her, his eyes alight with passion. It's about creating spaces where life can happen, where memories can grow. She'd kissed him then, not caring that her expensive dress was getting wrinkled against his dusty truck. That was the moment she'd started to imagine a different kind of life than the one her father had planned for her. The last mile was the hardest. The private road to the cabin was better maintained than she expected. Someone had recently graded it and cleared fallen branches. As she rounded the final bend, her heart stopped. The cabin emerged from the trees, and for a moment, time collapsed. The new roofing materials and fresh lumber by the porch marked recent work, but the essence was unchanged. Their dream, still standing. A blue pickup truck was parked in the clearing, tools visible in its bed. The mysterious restorer was here. Claire gripped the steering wheel, suddenly unsure. What would she say? How could she explain her presence? After so many years of absence, the old map slipped from the passenger seat as she braked, landing open on the floor. Something fell from between its folds. A pressed wildflower. its purple petals impossibly preserved. She remembered the day. She'd picked it, how Michael had taught her its name, how he'd carefully placed it in the map for safekeeping. "So you'll always remember this summer," he'd said, as if she could ever forget. Rain began to speckle her windshield. The storm the forecast had predicted was rolling in. Through the drops, she could see someone moving on the cabin's porch, carrying lumber inside ahead of the weather. It was time. 40 years of running, of building walls around her heart, had led her back to this moment. Claire Montgomery, the Oracle of Manhattan, who could make billion-dollar decisions without blinking, sat in her luxury car at the end of a mountain road, terrified of walking into her own past. Thomas heard the car before he saw it, the quiet purr of an expensive engine replacing the gentle sound of rain on leaves. He'd been securing tools and materials against the approaching storm, his mind still full of the letters he'd found. Now standing on the porch, he watched a sleek Mercedes ease to a stop beside his weathered pickup. For a long moment, nothing happened. The car sat idling, rain beading on its dark surface. Then the driver's door opened, and a woman emerged. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from decades of commanding rooms. But Thomas caught the slight hesitation in her step as she looked up at the cabin. He knew who she was before she spoke. The photos in the box might have been 40 years old, but there was no mistaking Claire Montgomery. Time had silvered her hair and added dignity to her bearing, but her eyes were the same ones that had gazed so lovingly at Michael Sullivan in those faded photographs. "You must be the one restoring it," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the rain. She hadn't moved from beside her car, as if uncertain of her right to come closer. "Thomas Wheeler." He descended the porch steps, offering what shelter his umbrella could provide. "I'm guessing you're Claire Montgomery." Surprise flickered across her face. "How did you—" "Found some old photographs, and the local hardware store owner, Frank. He remembers the summer you spent here." Thomas gestured toward the porch. "Storm's coming in fast. Maybe we should continue this conversation inside." Claire hesitated, then nodded. Thomas noticed how her hand trembled slightly as it gripped the porch railing, the same railing he'd spent yesterday refinishing. Inside, the cabin was dim with stormlight, but he'd made good progress. The floors gleamed with fresh varnish, and the stone fireplace had been carefully restored to its original beauty. "You've done beautiful work," Claire said softly, her eyes taking in every detail. "The craftsmanship, it reminds me of—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Michael Sullivan's original design was remarkable," Thomas said gently. "I've been working from his blueprints." Claire turned to him sharply. "You have the blueprints?" "Found them in the Lake Placid Records office. I needed them to understand how to properly restore the foundation." He paused, deciding how much to reveal. "I found other things too. Letters, a box behind the bookshelf." The color drained from Claire's face. She moved to the window. The same window where she'd sat writing one of those letters, Thomas realized. Outside, the storm was gathering force, rain now falling in sheets. "I suppose I owe you an explanation," she said finally. "This is my property after all, though I haven't been here in 40 years, Thomas finished. The letters told that story. He moved to his tool chest, retrieving the wooden box. "I think this belongs to you." Claire stared at the box as if it might bite her. I thought Michael would have taken it, or that it had been lost over the years." Her hands shook as she touched the lid. "You read them? Enough to understand that this place is more than just another restoration project." Thunder rolled across the lake as Thomas chose his next words carefully. "Mrs. Montgomery, I need to know, are you here to stop the restoration? Because I should tell you, legally speaking, the work I've done." "No," she interrupted. "No, I'm not here to stop anything. I'm here because—" She opened the box, finding the photograph of herself and Michael on the half-built porch. "I'm here because 40 years is long enough to run from your own heart." Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in stark relief. In that bright moment, Thomas saw tears in Claire's eyes, though her voice remained steady. "Tell me about what you've found," she said. "Tell me about how you're bringing it back to life." And so, as the storm raged outside, Thomas began to explain his work, watching as Claire Montgomery, the famous Oracle of Manhattan, ran her fingers along restored woodwork and smiled at remembered details. She was no longer just the owner of a property he'd been restoring. She was part of the cabin's story, and somehow he had become part of it too. Morning arrived with the aftermath of the storm. Broken branches scattered across the clearing and puddles reflecting the early light. Thomas found Claire already on the porch when he pulled up, her elegant Manhattan attire replaced by jeans, and a flannel shirt that made her look more like the young woman from the photographs. "I hope you don't mind," she said, holding up a notebook. "I've been making notes. There are things about the original design, details Michael incorporated, that aren't in the blueprints." Thomas set his toolbox down, intrigued. "What kind of details?" "The window seat in the reading nook, for instance." Claire led him inside. "The angle isn't arbitrary. Michael designed it so that on the summer solstice, the morning light falls exactly on the built-in bookshelf. He called it creating moments of magic." They spent the morning creating a shared renovation plan, Claire's intimate knowledge of the cabin's original design complementing Thomas's restoration expertise. She remembered how the kitchen cabinets had been crafted to hide their hinges, the way the floorboards had been laid to account for seasonal movement, the secret compartment in the stairs that had held their wine collection. Michael thought of everything, Thomas said, adding another detail to their growing list. "He always said architecture should tell a story." Claire ran her hand along a wall beam. "I never fully understood what he meant until now. Every piece of this cabin was part of our story." The awkwardness between them began to ease as they worked. Claire proved surprisingly knowledgeable about construction, explaining how she'd helped Michael with the original build. "I was terrible at first," she admitted, laughing as she helped Thomas measure lumber for the porch repair. "But Michael was patient. He taught me that creating something with your own hands changes how you see the world." By afternoon, they had settled into a rhythm. Thomas worked on replacing damaged boards, while Claire cleaned and catalogued original fixtures they could salvage. The comfortable silence was broken only by the occasional question or shared observation. "What made you start this?" Claire asked finally, sorting through a box of original door hardware. "Of all the buildings you could restore, why this one?" Thomas paused in his work. "I've been asking myself that since I found your letters. Something about this place just called to me. After my wife Sarah passed, I started looking for projects that meant something, places with stories worth saving." Claire nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And now that you know the story, now I understand why it felt important." He showed her the restoration plans he'd drawn up. "I've tried to honor the original vision while strengthening what time has weakened. Sometimes the best way to preserve something is to help it grow." They broke for lunch on the porch, sharing the sandwiches Thomas had brought. Claire told him about her life in Manhattan, the empire she'd built, the choices that had led her away from this place. Thomas spoke of his years of restoration work, of Sarah, of finding purpose in bringing old buildings back to life. "You know," Claire said, studying their shared renovation plan, "for the first time in 40 years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She looked up at Thomas. "Thank you for taking care of this place, for seeing its value." As the afternoon light began to fade, they stood together reviewing their progress. The cabin seemed to glow from within, as if responding to their shared care and attention. Tomorrow would bring more work, more discoveries, more moments of connection between past and present. But for now, they had found their footing in this shared space between what was and what could be. The discovery came while they were clearing the attic. Thomas was checking the rafters for water damage when his flashlight beam caught something metallic in the corner. Behind a stack of old building materials, a battered tin box sat waiting. "Claire!" he called down through the attic hatch. "I think you might want to see this." She climbed the ladder with surprising agility, ducking under the low beams. When Thomas handed her the box, her breath caught. "Michael's old Polaroid camera," she said softly. "I can't believe it's still here." Inside the tin, they found a collection of photographs, preserved by the attic's dry air. Claire settled onto an old trunk, Thomas's flashlight providing enough light to see. The first photo showed the land before construction, just empty forest and promise. "This was the day we bought the property," Claire said, her voice distant with memory. "Michael insisted on documenting everything. He said building a home was like writing a story in wood and stone, and every chapter mattered." They went through the photos together, Claire's stories flowing more freely with each image. Michael measuring the foundation lines, Claire attempting to operate a power saw, her face a mix of determination and terror. The first walls going up, sunset picnics on half-finished floors, friends and local craftsmen who'd helped with the build. Every photo was a moment frozen in time, a piece of the story they'd tried to write together. "Look at this one," Thomas said, holding up a photo of Claire asleep in the window seat, architectural plans scattered around her. Sunlight streamed through the uncurtained windows, catching her young face in profile. "Michael took that without me knowing," she smiled. "We'd been up all night discussing design changes. I wanted to add a music nook, and he was trying to figure out how to adjust the floor plan without compromising the structural integrity." They found more treasures as they worked. Claire's old sketchpad filled with amateur attempts at architectural drawing, a half-empty bottle of the wine they'd shared on moving-in day, Michael's collection of wood samples, labeled with notes about grain patterns and seasonal movement. "He taught me to read wood grain like a story," Claire said, running her fingers over a piece of oak. "How the tree's life was written in every ring and whirl. I used to think it was just his poetic nature, but later I realized it made me a better businesswoman, learning to look beneath surfaces, to understand the hidden patterns in things." As afternoon light filtered through the attic's dusty windows, they sorted their discoveries into careful piles. Items to preserve, materials to use in the restoration, memories to honor. Thomas watched Claire photograph each artifact with her phone, arguably more precious than the original Polaroids in their ability to instantly share and preserve. "Rachel, my assistant, found some information about Michael," she said quietly, putting down a photo of the completed cabin. "He never married, built a successful sustainable architecture firm in Oregon, focused on community projects. Retired 5 years ago." She paused. "He never sold his half of the cabin." Thomas thought of the letter he'd found in the foundation cornerstone, still waiting to be discovered again. Maybe he was keeping a promise, or maybe, like me, he couldn't. "Let go." Claire stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "You know what's strange? All these years building Montgomery Financial, I thought I was creating my legacy. But sitting here, looking at these photos, I realize I've never created anything as real as what we built that summer." Thomas understood. Every restoration project he'd undertaken had taught him the same truth, that the most meaningful architecture wasn't about the grandest structures, but about the spaces that held real life, real love, real stories. "We should incorporate some of these into the restoration," he suggested. "Not just preserve them, but make them part of the cabin's continuing story." Claire nodded, holding up the photo of the empty land where their dream had started. "Yes," she said, "it's time to write the next chapter." The weather forecast had warned them, but the speed with which the storm front moved in still caught them by surprise. Thomas was on the roof when the first gust hit, strong enough to send loose shingles skittering down the slope. Below, Claire's voice carried over the rising wind. "Thomas, the Weather Service just issued a severe storm warning. They're saying it could be worse than the 83 storm." The 83 storm. He'd seen references to it in the building inspection records, the benchmark against which all subsequent weather events were measured. It had hit just after the cabin's completion, testing Michael's design against nature's fury. "We need to secure everything," Thomas called down, already gathering his tools. That section of roof isn't ready for this kind of weather. They worked quickly, Claire proving herself as capable as she'd been 40 years ago. She helped Thomas lay emergency weatherproofing over the exposed sections, while he marveled at how naturally they'd fallen into sync. The wind grew stronger, carrying the scent of rain. The storage shed, Claire suddenly remembered. Michael built it to protect the generator, but the door was damaged. If it floods again, she was already moving through the rain, Thomas close behind. The shed stood apart from the main cabin, its design clearly marking it as Michael's work. The door hung askew, years of weather having warped the frame. Inside, the generator waited. Not the original, but its modern replacement, crucial for maintaining power during storms. He modified the design after that first storm, Claire said, helping Thomas brace the door. Added these channels to direct water away from the foundation. Michael always learned from his mistakes, made everything better. Thunder cracked overhead as they worked, rain now falling in sheets. Through the deluge, Thomas noticed water pooling, ominously near the cabin's newly repaired foundation corner. The drainage system, he realized. It's not complete. The new grading hasn't had time to settle. They splashed through puddles, using tarps and sandbags to direct water away from the vulnerable stonework. Claire's corporate polish had long since washed away, replaced by the determined focus Thomas recognized from those old Polaroids. "Like this," she said, showing him how to angle the barriers. Michael designed the original drainage to work with the land's natural contours. A particularly fierce gust caught one of the tarps, threatening to tear it loose. They grabbed it together, shoulders touching as they fought the wind. In that moment, Thomas saw something shift in Claire's expression. Fear, but not of the storm. "We almost lost the cabin in '83, she said, voice barely audible above the wind. "I was in Manhattan by then, trying to prove myself to the board. Michael called, asking me to come help him protect what we'd built. I didn't come." The rain hammered around them as they secured the tarp. "You're here now," Thomas said simply. Inside the cabin, they could still hear the storm's fury, but Michael's craftsmanship held true. They stood dripping on the kitchen floor, watching through windows as their emergency measures were tested by wind and rain. "I should check the upper windows," Thomas said, reaching for a towel. "The east dormer," Claire added. "It always leaked during northeastern storms. Michael meant to redesign it, but—" She trailed off, and Thomas understood. It was one of many plans interrupted by her departure. They worked their way through the cabin, checking for leaks, reinforcing where needed. Every so often the wind would die down, enough to hear the generator's steady hum, a reminder that some things, at least, were working as intended. As evening approached, the storm showed no signs of weakening. They'd done all they could to protect the cabin. Now they could only wait, hoping that their efforts, combined with Michael's original design, would be enough. "It's strange," Claire said, watching the rain trace patterns on the windows. "All those years in Manhattan, I thought I was working to build something permanent, but sitting here, watching another storm pass through, I'm realizing maybe permanence isn't about avoiding damage. Maybe it's about having the courage to rebuild what matters, as many times as it takes." The morning after the storm brought fresh challenges. While the cabin had weathered the night, the partially restored sections showed signs of water damage. Thomas stood in the reading nook, examining dark stains spreading across their unfinished work. Behind him, Claire's phone buzzed for the dozenth time that morning. "No, James, I won't be back for the Singapore merger." Her voice carried that familiar executive authority, but Thomas caught the weariness underneath. "The board will have to—" "Yes, I understand the implications. Handle it." She ended the call, and the cabin fell into heavy silence. Thomas continued, working, trying to give her space, but he could feel the tension building. Everything they'd been avoiding was rising to the surface, like water finding its way through wooden beams. "It's the same, isn't it?" Claire said finally. "Different decade, different storm, same choice." Thomas set down his tools. Is it the same choice? My father's dead. I run the company now, but somehow I'm still letting it pull me away from... She gestured at the water-damaged walls. From things that matter. Claire, Thomas said carefully, why did you really come back here? She moved to the window seat, her old spot, where Michael had photographed her sleeping among architectural plans. I told myself it was because someone was restoring my property without permission. Then I told myself it was about confronting the past. She laughed softly. But maybe I just needed to remember who I was before I became the Oracle of Manhattan. Thomas pulled out the half-finished restoration plans they'd been working on together. Their shared notes covered the margins, Claire's elegant script mixing with his practical annotations. And who was that person? Someone who believed in building things that last. Real things, not just stock portfolios and corporate acquisitions. She touched the water stains spreading across their recent work. Someone who understood that some damage can't be fixed by throwing money at it. The damage isn't that bad, Thomas said, but they both knew he wasn't talking about the water stains. I found him, you know. Claire's voice was so quiet, Thomas almost missed it. Michael, his firm in Oregon, is doing amazing work. Sustainable housing, community centers, everything he dreamed of. He's designed spaces that changed people's lives. She pulled out her phone, showing Thomas a photo of a beautiful community center built into the side of a mountain. He did it without compromising who he was. While I built an empire, Thomas finished. That's not nothing, Claire. No, but at what cost? She stood abruptly. Do you know what I thought when I first saw you working on the cabin? I thought, here's someone else trying to fix what I broke, just like Michael tried to fix things by leaving, giving me space to choose. Just like my father tried to fix things by doubling my stake in the company. Her voice cracked. But some things can't be fixed. They can only be rebuilt. Thomas thought of Sarah then. How after her diagnosis, she'd spent hours in his workshop, watching him restore old furniture. Sometimes, she told him, loving. Something means accepting that it won't be the same as it was before. Claire, he said now, I'm not trying to fix the past. I'm trying to preserve what matters while making space for something new. He gestured at their shared restoration plans. Every choice we've made here, it's not about erasing what happened. It's about honoring it while building something stronger. Claire stared at him for a long moment, then walked to her bag and pulled out a familiar copper tube, the one Thomas had carefully replaced in the cornerstone. I found this yesterday, she said. You knew it was there, didn't you? Thomas nodded slowly. I thought you should be the one to find it. All these years, his letter was waiting in the foundation, just like he waited in Oregon. She gripped the tube tightly. I don't know how to build something new when I'm still carrying the weight of what I destroyed. The cabin creaked around them, settling after the storm, as if reminding them of its presence. Their half-finished restoration work stood as testament to both what had been lost and what might still be saved. Maybe, Thomas said gently, that's exactly where you need to start. The old newspaper had been carefully preserved between the pages of Thomas's restoration journal. He hadn't planned to show it to Claire yet. Wasn't sure if he should show it at all. But watching her grip Michael's copper tube, seeing the weight of unspoken truths in her shoulders, he knew it was time. There's something else you should see, he said, retrieving the yellowed clipping. I found this while researching the cabin's history. Claire took the paper carefully. The article was from the Lake Placid Register, dated spring 1984. Local. Architect's innovative design wins national award. Below the headline was a photo of Michael Sullivan standing in front of a scale model of the cabin. Sullivan's revolutionary approach to sustainable mountain architecture, Claire read aloud, demonstrates that luxury and environmental responsibility can coexist. I never knew. He used our cabin as his portfolio piece. Keep reading, Thomas said quietly. Her eyes scanned down the page, then stopped. Thomas knew the exact line she'd reached. He'd read it dozens of times himself. Sullivan credits his co-designer C. Montgomery, whose innovative solutions to the site's natural challenges proved instrumental to the project's success. He never took sole credit, Thomas said. Every interview, every award, he acknowledged your contribution, even after you left. Claire sank into the window seat, the newspaper trembling in her hands. I thought he'd be angry, that he'd want to erase me from the story. There's more. Thomas hesitated, then continued. Frank at the hardware store. He told me Michael came back every year on the same date, for the first 5 years after you left, just to check on the cabin, make sure it was being maintained. October 15th, Claire whispered. The day we first found this property. The locals say he'd spend the day doing small repairs, then leave before sunset. Always alone, always quiet, then one year he didn't come back. Claire's business mask had completely crumbled, because I sold my soul to Manhattan instead of choosing love, because I was too afraid to build something real. No, Thomas said firmly, because he understood that sometimes people need to build different kinds of foundations. He gestured at the newspaper. Look at the date. This article came out right when Montgomery Financial was starting its legendary rise. The same year you pioneered that sustainable investment strategy that changed Wall Street's approach to environmental funds. Claire looked up sharply. How do you know about that? Sarah, my late wife. She was a financial journalist. That story was one of her favorites. The tough-as-nails CEO who insisted that profit and planet could coexist, who forced corporate America to think beyond the next quarter. He smiled gently. She never knew she was writing about someone who'd learned that lesson in a mountain cabin. Michael's influence, Claire said softly. Everything he taught me about sustainable design, about thinking in generations instead of years. I tried to translate it into the language of finance. And it worked. You built something meaningful. Claire, different from what you and Michael dreamed, but meaningful all the same. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the mountains. All these years, I thought I had to choose between his world and my father's, between love and legacy. She touched the copper tube containing Michael's letter. But maybe the real failure wasn't in the choice I made. Maybe it was in believing I had to choose at all. Thomas thought of the careful craftsmanship in every corner of the cabin, the way Michael had designed it to work with the land rather than against it. Some architecture, he said, is invisible to most people. It's in the way things work together, the hidden connections that make everything stronger. Like the way he designed the foundation, Claire added, understanding dawning in her eyes. Multiple systems supporting each other, each doing what it does best. She looked around the cabin, their shared restoration work merging seamlessly with the original structure. Oh, Michael, she whispered, I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes and possibilities. Outside, the mountain air was sharp with autumn and change. Something was shifting. Thomas could feel it, not just in Claire, but in the cabin itself, as if the very walls were exhaling a long-held breath. I need to make a call, Claire said suddenly, pulling out her phone. Not to the office this time, to Oregon. The call to Oregon hadn't been easy. After 40 years, what could you say? Claire had left Thomas to work on the water damage while she paced the shoreline, phone pressed to her ear. From the kitchen window, he could see her gesturing as she talked, stopping occasionally to stare out at the lake. When she finally returned, her eyes were red but clear. He's coming, she said simply. Next week. He says he'd like to see what we've done with his design. Thomas nodded, continuing his careful repair of the damaged wall panel. And how do you feel about that? Terrified, hopeful, grateful. She picked up a sand block and began helping him smooth the repair. He laughed, said he's been following my career all these years, through the financial pages, called me his favorite architectural project gone rogue. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their shared labor punctuated by the occasional murmur of guidance or request for a tool. The morning light played across their fresh repairs, highlighting the way old and new wood merged seamlessly. "I need to do something before he arrives," Claire said finally. "The guest book you mentioned. I'd like to help design it, not just as a record of visitors, but as a chronicle of the cabin's whole story." Thomas smiled. "I think I know just the wood for it." He led her to his truck, pulling out a piece of figured maple he'd been saving. The grain pattern reminded me of flowing water. Thought it might be right for this place. They set up a temporary workbench on the porch, Claire watching intently as Thomas showed her how to prepare the wood. Her corporate polish had given way to a craftsman's focus, reminding him of the young woman in Michael's photographs. "You know," she said, carefully sanding along the grain, "I used to dream about the cabin. Not just remembering it, actually dreaming about what it could have become. A place where different worlds could meet and make something new." "It's not too late for that," Thomas said, showing her how to feel for rough spots with her fingertips. "Sometimes the best spaces are the ones that have been through something come out stronger." They worked through the afternoon, crafting not just a book, but a testament. Claire insisted on learning every step, the cutting, the joining, the careful finishing. By sunset, they had created something beautiful, a guest book whose cover told a story in wood grain and careful joinery. "The first entry should be yours," Claire said, handing Thomas a pen. "You're the one who saw what this place could still be." Thomas thought for a moment, then wrote, "Some restoration work fixes what's broken. The best kind reveals what was beautiful all along." Claire read his words, then added her own entry beneath. "Coming home isn't always about returning to a place. Sometimes it's about returning to a truth you once knew." They stood together on the porch as evening painted the mountains in autumn gold. The cabin behind them was a mix of old and new, damaged and restored, waiting and becoming. Through the window, they could see their shared renovation plans spread across the table, covered in notes and possibilities. "Michael will have ideas," Claire said, half statement, half question. "Good ones, probably," Thomas agreed. "We can incorporate them into what we've started, make something stronger than any of us could create alone." A local family of deer emerged from the tree line, making their evening journey to the lake. Claire watched them, a small smile playing at her lips. "You know what Michael always said about good design?" "What's that?" "That it should look inevitable. Like the space was always meant to be exactly what it became." She turned to Thomas. "Thank you for helping me find my way back to this space, to who I was meant to be." The first stars were appearing above the mountains as they gathered their tools and headed inside. Tomorrow would bring more work, more healing, more restoration. But for now, the cabin glowed with warmth and promise, its walls holding not just memories, but possibilities. Thomas heard the car before he saw it, a rental by the sound of the engine. He was up on the ladder, putting the finishing touches on the repaired dormer window, when the vehicle emerged from the tree line. Claire, who had been obsessively straightening tools that were already perfectly arranged, froze mid-motion. The man who stepped out of the car moved with the deliberate grace of someone used to considering his impact on the spaces around him. His hair had gone fully silver, but he carried himself with the same quiet confidence visible in those old Polaroids. Michael Sullivan stood for a long moment, taking in the cabin's partially restored state with an architect's eye. "You've honored the original design," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "But I see you've made some improvements to the drainage system." "That was Thomas's idea," Claire said, moving forward. "He understood what you were trying to do with the original layout." Michael turned toward her, and 40 years seemed to compress into a single breath. "Claire," he said softly, "you look exactly the same when you're trying not to show what you're feeling." Thomas quietly descended the ladder, gathering his tools to give them space. But Michael held up a hand. "Please stay. I'd like to see what you've done with my favorite project." They walked the property together, Michael noting each modification with professional interest and personal emotion. At the repaired foundation corner, he knelt to examine the stonework. This is beautiful work. You've maintained the aesthetic while improving the structural integrity. Claire remembered how you designed it to work with the land, Thomas said. We just enhanced what was already there. Michael smiled. That was always her gift, seeing the potential in things. Whether it was a building site or a market opportunity, he stood, brushing dirt from his knees. I've followed your career, Claire. What you did with sustainable investment strategies. You took everything we talked about here and gave it a whole new framework. I learned it from you, Claire said. The importance of building things that last, that work with their environment instead of against it. She paused. I found your letter in the cornerstone. Michael's expression softened. Ah, I wondered if it was still there. Why didn't you? Tell me about the design award? About crediting me as co-designer? Would it have changed anything? He asked gently. You needed to build your own foundation, Claire. I understood that, even if it broke both our hearts. They reached the porch, where their new guest book lay open on the table. Michael ran his fingers over the figured maple cover, appreciating the craftsmanship. Beautiful grain pattern, like water flowing over stones. That's exactly what Thomas said when he chose it, Claire smiled. We wanted it to tell the cabin's whole story. Speaking of stories, Michael said, pulling a roll of papers from his bag, I brought something that might interest you both. Alternative designs I've been working on over the years, ways to expand the cabin while maintaining its character. Just sketches, really. A hobby to keep my mind occupied during long Oregon winters. He spread the drawings out, and Thomas caught his breath. The designs were magnificent, subtle additions that seemed to grow organically from the original structure, each one building on the cabin's inherent harmony with the landscape. You never stop thinking about this place, Claire said, wonder in her voice. How could I? It's where I did my best work, where I learned that sometimes loving something means letting it become what it needs to be. Michael looked between them. So, shall we see if there's anything in these old drawings worth building? The afternoon light caught the silver in all their hair as they bent over the plans together, the architect, the craftsman, and the woman who had bridged their worlds. In the comfortable silence, broken only by the rustle of papers and murmured observations, the cabin seemed to settle around them, as if finally exhaling a long-held breath. You know, Michael said eventually, I always designed this place to be more than a summer home. I designed it to grow, to change, to welcome new stories. Then let's write the next chapter, Claire said, her hand finding his on the weathered porch rail. Together this time. Autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors as the last of the restoration work neared completion. The cabin stood proud against the October sky, its renewed structure a testament to three people's shared vision. Thomas carved the final touch, a new sign for the entrance, its letters deep and sure, Sullivan and Montgomery Cabin, Esther 1983, restored 2025. Not going to add your own name? Claire asked, watching him work at his portable bench on the porch. I'm just the caretaker, Thomas replied, but Michael shook his head from where he sat sketching expansion plans. You're more than that. You saw what this place could be when the rest of us had lost sight of it. He stood, brushing graphite from his hands. Add it, Thomas. Wheeler Restoration. Make it complete. The morning sun warmed the porch as Thomas carefully added his name to the sign. Around them, the cabin seemed to glow with renewed purpose. The restored reading nook now housed not only books, but the guest book they'd crafted together, its pages already holding the beginning of their shared story. Michael's expansion plans lay nearby, waiting to become reality. The board approved my sabbatical, Claire said, pouring coffee into 3 mugs. A morning ritual they'd developed over the past week. 6 months to start, though James thinks I'm having a late-life crisis. And are you? Thomas asked, setting down his carving tools. No, she smiled, handing out the coffee. For the first time in 40 years, I'm thinking clearly. The Montgomery Foundation's new Sustainable Architecture Initiative needs someone with vision, to lead it, someone who understands both the financial and human aspects of building communities. Michael looked up from his sketches. "You're not asking me to move to Manhattan, are you?" "No," Claire laughed. "I'm telling you I'm moving the initiative's headquarters to Oregon. If you're willing to be our chief architectural advisor, part-time, of course, you'll need your summers free for this place." They sat together on the porch steps, watching the morning mist rise off the lake. Thomas thought about Sarah, about how she would have loved seeing this restoration, not just of the cabin, but of the hearts it held. "You know," Michael said, "when I designed this place, I included something I never told anyone about. A time capsule built into the main fireplace. I always meant to fill it, but then—" "Show me," Claire said softly. They followed Michael inside to the great stone fireplace that had withstood 40 years of winters. He pressed a hidden catch, and a small compartment opened in the stonework. Empty, waiting. "I thought we could fill it now," he said. "Not with what might have been, but with what is. What will be." Claire nodded, understanding. She went to her bag and returned with the old business card that had started her journey back. Thomas contributed a piece of the original roof timber, marked with the date of their restoration. Michael added his latest sketches for the cabin's future. "For the next generation to find," he said, sealing the compartment. "So they'll know that some buildings are more than just walls and windows. They're the spaces where life finds its way back to what matters." Later that evening, as sunset painted the cabin in shades of gold, the three of them stood by the lake. Thomas would return home tomorrow. He had other restorations waiting, other buildings needing his care. But he knew this place would draw him back, just as it had drawn Claire and Michael back to each other. "What do you see when you look at it now?" he asked them. Claire leaned against Michael's shoulder, her corporate armor long since replaced by comfortable authenticity. "I see every version of the cabin, what it was, what it is, what it will become. Like rings in a tree, each layer making it stronger. I see a dream that never really died," Michael added. "It just needed time to grow into something better than we originally imagined." Thomas looked at the sign he'd carved, at their three names linked by history and hope. "I see a restoration that restored more than just a building." The cabin glowed in the fading light, its windows warm with welcome. Inside, their coffee cups waited on the porch rail, and the guest book lay open to fresh pages, ready for new stories to be written. Some by the three of them, some by others who would find their way here, drawn by the magic of a place that had learned how to hold both memory and possibility in its restored heart. After all, the best buildings, like the best stories, never really end. They just keep growing, one careful restoration at a time.